Okay, so for our first main kind of focus topic, I think it's really, really important that we understand how we got to a situation in 1939 where people were very supportive of this idea of prejudice, hatred towards the Jews. So remember that word I use is anti-Semitism, where you're prejudiced towards the Jewish people. Now, if we were to just say to society, we're going to be like that, I think lots of people would say, no, I think that's wrong. So we need to understand why by this time in Germany especially, but also in all over Europe actually, these ideas had already existed for quite a long time. So we're going to track a timeline of anti-Semitism. And I want you to pay close attention to what's happening, because I'm going to ask you some important questions at the end. So in 70 AD, if I move out the way, in 70 AD, the Romans destroyed Jerusalem and expelled the Jews from their homeland. So Jewish people were living in Jerusalem, and in 70 AD, the Romans went in and expelled them. Jewish people then, from that point, had nowhere to live, and wherever country they went to, they felt like they didn't belong, and they were often seen as people who didn't belong there. Okay, stop 2 on the timeline. In the Middle Ages, and the dates we're looking at is from 1000 to 1400, the Pope declared that Christians were not allowed to lend money. Now, this became a job that's then open to Jewish people, since it's not against their religion. They're allowed to do it because they're not part of the Christian church. Therefore, the poor began to hate the Jews, since they were often in debt to them. So because the Pope said that Christians weren't allowed to lend money, it often became that the Jews were people that were lending money, and therefore they became hated by lots of people that owed money to them, that felt they were having to pay back debts to them. They were often a bit wealthier than the other Christians, and so we start to see a difference occurring between the two different religious groups. Right, the situation got even worse in 1190, where there was a massacre of 150 Jews in the city of York, which is in England. So as you can see, the Jewish people were inside this castle, and there's all the masses of people down here who were kind of fighting against the castle, and they set fire to the castle was destroyed, and everybody was killed. So this really shows kind of a hatred and dislike of this particular group of people at the time. I just wanted to show you the memorial plaque that was put in front of where this site is today. I'll just move out of the way so you can read what it says if you'd like to. But this is the memorial plaque that was put there to commemorate these 150 people that were massacred, murdered on this site. Okay, so 100 years later in 1290, King Edward, who was the King of England at this time, expelled, which means sent away, all the Jews out of England. The same thing also happened in Spain. However, this was in 1492, and Ferdinand and Isabella, who were the leaders of Spain at this time, the Spanish king and queen, expelled all the Jews from Spain. So that shows that there really is this prejudice, this kind of really strong dislike for this group of people at this time. You know, this idea of sending them away. We don't want them in our country anymore. So Judaism is obviously a faith, it's a religion, and you might think that people who are religious are very open and tolerant to everybody else, and that's kind of what we like to think today. This man here, Martin Luther, is the man who's kind of given credit for creating the Protestant faith. And actually in 1543, he was a very, very influential Christian religious leader, and he writes a pamphlet called On the Jews and Their Lies. Now, this pamphlet criticizes Jewish moneylenders. Remember, the Jewish people only became kind of stereotypical moneylenders because the Pope said Christians weren't allowed to do it. So they were just filling the role as they could do it. And Martin Luther wrote that all Jewish synagogues should be destroyed. So that's a religious leader encouraging, violence towards Jewish religious buildings. Now, in 1881 in Russia, the Russian Tsar, and Tsar is the name we give king in Russia, so the Russian king, Alexander II, was assassinated. The Jews were blamed, even though it wasn't necessarily, or it wasn't their fault, and there were many anti-Jewish riots across the country. Synagogues, which are the Jewish churches, the Jewish religious buildings, synagogues were burnt down, and Jewish people were attacked. So there's absolutely no reason for this. They're being blamed for something they didn't do, and it's sparking all of this anti-Semitic violence, this violence against Jewish people. Okay, the next step on the timeline is 1918. And after the First World War ended in 1918, hundreds of Jews were murdered in Germany as a number of people blamed them for Germany's defeat in the war. Okay, so the next place, I'm still in Germany, but I'm going a bit further ahead. So I'm in 1930 to 1932, and Germany are going through a Great Depression. There's lots and lots of people in poverty, there's lots of poor, and there's lots of unemployed people. Now, they are encouraged to turn on the Jews by the Nazis and by Hitler, who comes to power and starts spreading these lies, basically. And many Jews are rich and successful still, and therefore Hitler often makes the comparison of it's their fault. You know, they're the ones that are guilty. They're the reason that you haven't, that you're poor and in poverty. And it starts to change people's mindsets slightly and makes them prejudiced, makes them dislike the Jews as a group of people. So in all of those examples, I think the one thing to be really clear about is that it wasn't anything that the Jewish people did that made people feel like this about them. It was the fact that right from the very beginning, they were always kind of a migratory group that came in or moved on or were sent away from places. And they never really were accepted, or they never felt like people thought they should belong in one place. They were always a little bit different. Now, that was why they're targeted as a group, not because they did anything wrong. So all of these previous examples, you know, they definitely did not deserve all the horrible things that were done to them. And I just wanted to show you this timeline to show you that this feeling of anti-Semitism has happened throughout time. It's something which has developed and which has grown. It wasn't something which just randomly happened in Germany by the Second World War. It's something which has developed over time. Now, we can put these examples we've just seen into three main categories. We can put them into a group of category which we might call massacre, the deliberate killing of lots of people. We can talk about them in terms of persecution, or to persecute, to deliberately treat badly a group of people, and expel or expulsion, to force people to leave a city or a country. And that's what we've seen quite a few times in the timeline. So hopefully I've shown you that anti-Semitism has kind of a historic legacy. It's been around for a long time before it escalates in Germany during the war, and that even sometimes other religious groups are involved in this narrative against the Jews. So in terms of cases where we see persecution, we've obviously got the words from Martin Luther encouraging people to attack synagogues. We've got the treatment of what happened in Russia. For a bit of a higher term vocabulary there, we often call these the pogroms, where Jews were targeted in Russia. In terms of examples of expulsion of Jews, we've got England and we've got Spain. So we've got 1290 and 1492. The Jews were expelled from England and from Spain. We could also have had when the Romans expelled the Jews from Jerusalem in 70 AD. And finally, examples of massacres. We've got the 1190 case in England, in York, where 150 Jews are murdered. And we've got the case in Germany after the First World War, where lots of Jews are murdered in Germany and blamed for the defeat in the war. Now, these are not the only examples. They are just a handful of examples. But hopefully you can see that this prejudice, this dislike, this unfair treatment of this group of people just because of who they are, the religion they follow, and the way they live, has been happening all over time. Now, there is a reason why we might track and connect all of these events together. So in a lot of these cases, the Jewish people are being blamed for things, and that doesn't mean they're responsible. They become over time what we might call a scapegoat. a group that's easy to target and blame for something. Now, a scapegoat refers to the practice in the past where a goat is sacrificed, and with his death, he takes away the sins of others. So, going all the way back to the Greek and Roman times, if the Greeks felt that the gods were angry with them, they would sacrifice an animal, and with the death of that animal, the gods would be appeased. So it's the idea that this goat is dying and being blamed and therefore being punished for the sins of other people. And that's where we get the word scapegoat from. So think for a moment, who would be a perfect scapegoat if you wanted to find someone to blame things on? Well, you need to find a group of people that were isolated in society, who were often different and acted in different ways than most other people did. It would also help if that group were a minority, so they were a lot smaller than most other groups in society. So if there's 10 Jewish people but 100 other people, they're a minority, they're a smaller group within the bigger group. Okay, now Jews often fitted into this description, so therefore it's really easy for leaders to blame them for problems that were going on. Furthermore, once there's already been a background and history of one group being blamed, it becomes easier to keep blaming them in the future. For example, if I knew in my class there was a student who kept throwing paper at me whenever my back was turned, and he did this 5 times in a row, and I caught him 5 times in a row, by the 6th time, when I turned around, if it was somebody else, you could probably blame that other person and I'd believe you. And that person would become your scapegoat. So just say student A threw paper at me 5 times, and actually the 6th time it was student B, but when I turned around, I hadn't seen who it was. Student B said to me, "Miss, it was student A." Well, he's already done it 5 times. He's been blamed 5 times. It's easy for me to blame them again because it fits into that narrative that we've created. Therefore, by the 1930s in Germany, it was really easy for Hitler and the Nazis to blame the Jews and start encouraging people to see them as the problem, as they had already been blamed in the past for things.